a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviet-Afghan War lasted over 9 years, from December 1979 to February 1989. Insurgent groups known collectively as the mujahideen, as well as smaller Maoist groups, fought a guerrilla war against the Soviet Army and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan government, mostly in the rural countryside. The mujahideen groups were backed primarily by the United States and Pakistan, making it a Cold War proxy war. Between 562,000 and 2 million civilians were killed and millions of Afghans fled the country as refugees, mostly to Pakistan and Iran. Prior to the arrival of Soviet troops, Afghanistan's Communist Party took power after a 1978 coup, installing Nur Mohammad Taraki as president. The party initiated a series of radical modernization reforms throughout the country that were deeply unpopular, particularly among the more traditional rural population and the established traditional power structures. The government's Stalinist-like nature of vigorously suppressing opposition, executing thousands of political prisoners, and ordering massacres against unarmed civilians, led to the rise of anti-government armed groups, and, by April 1979, large parts of the country were in open rebellion. The government itself experienced in-party rivalry, and in September 1979 Taraki was killed under orders of his rival and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hafizullah Amin, which deteriorated relations with the Soviet Union. Eventually the Soviet government, under leader Leonid Brezhnev, decided to deploy the 40th Army on December 24, 1979. Arriving in the capital Kabul, they staged a coup, killing President Amin and installing Soviet loyalist Babrak Karmal from a rival faction. The deployment has been variously called an invasion or a legitimate supporting intervention. In January 1980, foreign ministers from 34 nations of the Islamic Conference adopted a resolution demanding the immediate, urgent and unconditional withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, while the UN General Assembly passed a resolution protesting the Soviet intervention by a vote of 104-18. Afghan insurgents began to receive massive amounts of aid and military training in neighboring Pakistan and China, paid for primarily by the United States and Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf. As documented by the National Security Archive, the Central Intelligence Agency played a significant role in asserting U.S. influence in Afghanistan by funding military operations designed to frustrate the Soviet invasion of that country. CIA covert action worked through Pakistani intelligence services to reach Afghan rebel groups. Soviet troops occupied the cities and main arteries of communication, while the mujahideen waged guerrilla war in small groups operating in the almost 80% of the country that was outside government and Soviet control, almost exclusively being the rural countryside. The Soviets used their air power to deal harshly with both rebels and civilians, leveling villages to deny safe haven to the mujahideen, destroying vital irrigation ditches, and laying millions of landmines. The military intervention was sharply and almost immediately denounced by the international community, with numerous sanctions and embargoes being imposed against the Soviet Union and the US-led 1980 Summer Olympics boycott against Moscow, which was holding the event. The boycott and sanctions exacerbated Cold War tensions and enraged the Soviet government, which later began and led a revenge boycott of the 1984 Olympics held in Los Angeles. The Soviets initially planned to secure towns and roads, stabilize the government under new leader Karmal, and withdraw within 6 months or a year. But they were met with fierce resistance from the guerrillas, and were stuck in a bloody war that lasted 9 years. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet contingent was increased to 108,800, and fighting increased, but the military and diplomatic cost of the war to the USSR was high. By mid-1987 the Soviet Union, now under reformist leader Mikhail Gorbachev, announced it would start withdrawing its forces after meetings with the Afghan government. The final troop withdrawal started on May 15, 1988, and ended on February 15, 1989, leaving the government forces alone in its battle against the insurgents, which continued until 1992, when the former Soviet-backed government collapsed. Due to its length, it has sometimes been referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, or the Bear Trap, by the Western media. The Soviets' failure at the war is thought to be a contributing factor to the fall of the Soviet Union. background. In 1885, Russian forces seized the disputed oasis at Panjshir south of the Oxus River from Afghan forces, which became known as the Panjshir Incident. The border was agreed by the Joint Anglo-Russian-Afghan Boundary Commission of 1885–87. The Russian interest in the region continued on through the Soviet era, with billions in economic and military aid sent to Afghanistan between 1955 and 1978. After the Saur Revolution in 1978, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was formed on April 27, 1978. The government was one with a pro-poor, pro-farmer socialist agenda. It had close relations with the Soviet Union. On December 5, 1978, a treaty of friendship was signed between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. In February 1979, the United States ambassador to Afghanistan, Adolf Dubs, was kidnapped by Set Army militants and was later killed during an assault carried out by the Afghan police, assisted by Soviet advisors. Dubs' death led to a major deterioration in Afghanistan-United States relations. In southwestern Asia, drastic changes were taking place concurrent with the upheavals in Afghanistan. In February 1979, the Iranian Revolution ousted the American-backed Shah from Iran, losing the United States as one of its most powerful allies. The United States then deployed 20 ships in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, including 2 aircraft carriers. And there was a constant stream of threats of warfare between the US and Iran. March 1979 marked the signing of the US-backed peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. The Soviet leadership saw the agreement as giving a major advantage to the United States. A Soviet newspaper stated that Egypt and Israel were now gendarmes of the Pentagon. The Soviets viewed the treaty not only as a peace agreement between their erstwhile allies in Egypt and the US-supported Israelis, but also as a military pact. In addition, the US sold more than 5,000 missiles to Saudi Arabia. Also, the Soviet Union's previously strong relations with Iraq had recently soured. In June 1978, Iraq began entering into friendlier relations with the Western world and buying French and Italian-made weapons, though the vast majority still came from the Soviet Union, its Warsaw Pact allies, and China. Saur Revolution. King Muhammad Zahir Shah ascended to the throne and reigned from 1933 to 1973. Zahir's cousin, Muhammad Daoud Khan, served as prime minister from 1954 to 1963. The Marxist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan's strength grew considerably in these years. In 1967, the PDPA split into 2 rival factions, the Khalq faction headed by Nur Mohammad Taraki and Hafizul Amin, and the Parcham faction led by Babrak Karmal. Former Prime Minister Daoud seized power in a military coup on July 17, 1973 after allegations of corruption and poor economic conditions against the king's government. Daoud puts an end to the monarchy, and his time in power was widely popular among the general populace, but unpopular among PDPA supporters. Intense opposition from factions of the PDPA was sparked by the repression imposed on them by Daoud's regime and the death of a leading PDPA member, Mir Akbar Khyber. The mysterious circumstances of Khyber's death sparked massive anti-Daoud demonstrations in Kabul, which resulted in the arrest of several prominent PDPA leaders. On April 27, 1978, the Afghan army, which had been sympathetic to the PDPA cause, overthrew and executed Daoud along with members of his family. Nur Mohammad Taraki, Secretary-General of the PDPA, became President of the Revolutionary Council and Prime Minister of the newly established Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Factions inside the PDPA. After the revolution, Taraki assumed the presidency, prime ministership and general secretaryship of the PDPA. The government was divided along factional lines, with President Taraki and Deputy Prime Minister Hafizul Amin of the Khalq faction against Parcham leaders such as Babrak Karmal and Muhammad Najibullah. Within the PDPA, conflicts resulted in exiles, purges and executions of Parcham members. The PDPA executed between 10,000 and 27,000 people, mostly at Pulichaki prison prior to the Soviet intervention. During its first 18 months of rule, The PDPA applied a Soviet-style program of modernizing reforms, many of which were viewed by conservatives as opposing Islam. Decrees setting forth changes in marriage customs and land reform were not received well by a population deeply immersed in tradition and Islam, particularly by the powerful landowners who were harmed economically by the abolition of usury and the cancellation of farmers' debts. The new government also enhanced women's rights, sought a rapid eradication of illiteracy and promoted Afghanistan's ethnic minorities, although these programs appear to have had an effect only in the urban areas. By mid-1978, a rebellion started, with rebels attacking the local military garrison in the Nuristan region of eastern Afghanistan, and soon civil war spread throughout the country. In September 1979, Deputy Prime Minister Hafizul Amin seized power, arresting and killing President Taraki. Over 2 months of instability overwhelmed Amin's regime as he moved against his opponents in the PDPA and the growing rebellion. Soviet-Afghan relations. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had been a major power broker and influential mentor in the politics of its poorer and much smaller neighbor, its involvement ranging from civil military infrastructure to Afghan society. Since 1947, Afghanistan had been under the influence of the Soviet government and received large amounts of aid, economic assistance, military equipment training and military hardware from the Soviet Union. Economic assistance and aid had been provided to Afghanistan as early as 1919, shortly after the Russian Revolution and when the regime was facing the Russian Civil War. Provisions were given in the form of small arms, ammunition, a few aircraft, and $1 million gold rubles to support the resistance during the Third Anglo-Afghan War. In 1942, the USSR again moved to strengthen the Afghan armed forces by providing small arms and aircraft, and establishing training centers in Tashkent. Soviet-Afghan military cooperation began on a regular basis in 1956, and further agreements were made in the 1970s, which saw the USSR send advisors and specialists. In 1978, after witnessing India's nuclear test, Smiling Buddha, President Dawood Khan initiated a military build-up to counter Pakistan's armed forces and Iranian military influence in Afghan politics. A final pre-war treaty, signed in December 1978, allowed the PDPA to call upon the Soviet Union for military support. Following the Herat uprising, President Taraki contacted Alexei Kosygin, chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers, and asked for practical and technical assistance with men and armament. Kosygin was unfavorable to the proposal on the basis of the negative political repercussions such an action would have for his country, and he rejected all further attempts by Taraki to solicit Soviet military aid in Afghanistan. Following Kosygin's rejection, Taraki requested aid from Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Soviet head of state, who warned Taraki that full Soviet intervention would only play into the hands of our enemies, both yours and ours. Brezhnev also advised Taraki to ease up on the drastic social reforms and to seek broader support for his regime. In 1979, Taraki attended a conference of the Non-Aligned Movement in Havana, Cuba. On his way back, he stopped in Moscow on March 20 and met with Brezhnev, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko and other Soviet officials. It was rumored that Karmel was present at the meeting in an attempt to reconcile Taraki's Khalq faction and the Parcham against Amin and his followers. At the meeting, Taraki was successful in negotiating some Soviet support, including the redeployment of 2 Soviet armed divisions at the Soviet-Afghan border, the sending of 500 military and civilian advisors and specialists, and the immediate delivery of Soviet armed equipment sold at 25% below the original price. However, the Soviets were not pleased about the developments in Afghanistan, and Brezhnev impressed upon Taraki the need for party unity. Despite reaching this agreement with Taraki, the Soviets continued to be reluctant to intervene further in Afghanistan, and repeatedly refused Soviet military intervention within Afghan borders during Taraki's rule as well as later during Amin's short rule. Pakistani aid to insurgents. Afghanistan cemented regional problems with Pakistan, after Dawood pressed his hardline Pashtunistan policies to Pakistan. Pakistan retaliated, and Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto authorized a covert operation under Mir's Major General Nasir al-Ababa. In 1974, Bhutto authorized another secret operation in Kabul where the ICNVAI extradited Burhanuddin Rabbani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar to Peshawar, amid fear that Rabbani and Hekmatyar might be assassinated by Daoud. According to Baber, Bhutto's operation was an excellent idea, and it had hard-hitting impact on Daoud and his government, which forced Daoud to increase his desire to make peace with Bhutto. Another part of this operation was to train hardline Jamiat-e-Islami militants against the Daoud's secular government. However, this operation went into cold storage after Bhutto was removed from power. In June 1975, militants from the Jamiat-Islami Party attempted to overthrow the government. They started their rebellion in the Panjshir Valley, in the present-day Panjshir province, some 100 kilometers north of Kabul, and in a number of other provinces of the country. However, government forces easily defeated the insurgency, and a sizable portion of the insurgents sought refuge in Pakistan, where they enjoyed the support of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's government, which had been alarmed by Daoud's revival of the Pashtunistan issue. In 1978, the Taraki government initiated a series of reforms, including a radical modernization of the traditional Islamic civil and especially marriage law, aimed at uprooting feudalism in Afghan society. The government brooked no opposition to the reforms and responded with violence to unrest. Between April 1978 and the Soviet intervention of December 1979, thousands of prisoners, perhaps as many as 27,000, were executed at the notorious Pulichaki prison, including many village mullahs and headmen, other members of the traditional elite. The religious establishment and intelligentsia fled the country. Large parts of the country went into open rebellion. The Parcham government claimed that 11,000 were executed during the Amin/Taraki period in response to the revolts. The revolt began in October among the Nuristani tribes of the Kunar Valley in the northeastern part of the country near the border with Pakistan, and rapidly spread among the other ethnic groups. By the spring of 1979, 24 of the 28 provinces had suffered outbreaks of violence. The rebellion began to take hold in the cities. In March 1979 in Herat, rebels led by Ismail Khan revolted. Between 3,000 and 5,000 people were killed and wounded during the Herat revolt. Some 100 Soviet citizens and their families were killed. Killing of the U.S. ambassador. In February 1979, the contentious law and order situation led to a serious diplomatic incident involving United States, Soviet Union, and Afghanistan when U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan Adolf Spike Dubs was kidnapped by a mysterious group of militants. They are sometimes alleged to have been part of the radical communist faction, Setami-Meli, but are also sometimes described as Islamists. The National Oppression reportedly demanded the release of their communist leader Badruddin Blas, whom the Afghan government denied holding. The government refused categorically to negotiate with the militants, in spite of the U.S. Embassy's demands. The U.S. increased pressure on the Afghan government and the Soviet Union, forcefully demanding peaceful negotiations for the release of their ambassador. Dubs was held in room 117 of the Kabul hotel, where the United States sent its embassy and diplomatic staff to negotiate with the communist faction. The Afghan security forces, accompanied by the Russian advisors, swarmed the hallway and surrounding rooftops of the hotel. When negotiations stalled, there was an intense exchange of fire after Russian advisors ordered an assault. Documents released from the Soviet KGB Bureau archives by Vasily Mitrokhin in the early 1990s suggest that the Afghan government authorized the assault and that the KGB advisor on scene, Sergei Batrukhin, may have recommended the assault, as well as the execution of a kidnapper before U.S. experts could interrogate him. All attempts at negotiation failed, and U.S. Ambassador Adolf Dubs was caught in the crossfire, leading to his death. Afterwards, the United States formally expressed to Soviet Union its disapproval of the assault by the security forces, putting more stress on U.S.-Soviet relations. U.S. aid to insurgents. In the mid-1970s, Pakistani intelligence officials began privately lobbying the U.S. and its allies to send material assistance to the Islamist insurgents. Pakistani President Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq's ties with the U.S. had been strained during Jimmy Carter's presidency due to Pakistan's nuclear program and the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in April 1979. but Carter told National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance as early as January 1979 that it was vital to repair our relationships with Pakistan in light of the unrest in Iran. According to former Central Intelligence Agency official Robert Gates, the Carter administration turned to CIA to counter Soviet and Cuban aggression in the Third World, particularly beginning in mid-1979. In March 1979, CIA sent several covert action options relating to Afghanistan to the SCC Special Coordination Committee of the United States National Security Council. At a March 30 meeting, U.S. Department of Defense Representative Walter B. Slocum asked if there was value in keeping the Afghan insurgency going, sucking the Soviets into a Vietnamese quagmire. When asked to clarify this remark, Slocum explained, "Well, the whole idea was that if the Soviets decided to strike at this star baby, Afghanistan, we had every interest in making sure that they got stuck." Yet an April 5 memo from National Intelligence Officer Ronald Horelick warned covert action would raise the costs to the Soviets and inflame Muslim opinion against them in many countries. The risk was that a substantial U.S. covert aid program could raise the stakes and induce the Soviets to intervene more directly and vigorously than otherwise intended. In May 1979, U.S. officials secretly began meeting with rebel leaders through Pakistani government contacts. A former Pakistani military official claimed that he personally introduced a CIA official to Gulbuddin Hekmat Yar that month. After additional meetings on April 6 and July 3, Carter signed a presidential finding that authorized the CIA to spend just over $500,000 on non-lethal aid to the mujahideen, which seemed at the time a small beginning. Brzezinski later claimed that, "We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would." According to Brzezinski, he became convinced by mid-1979 that the Soviets were going to invade Afghanistan regardless of U.S. policy due to the Carter administration's failure to respond aggressively to Soviet activity in Africa. But, despite the risk of unintended consequences, support for the mujahideen could be an effective way to prevent Soviet aggression beyond Afghanistan. The full significance of the U.S. sending aid to the mujahideen prior to the invasion is debated among scholars. Some assert that it directly, and even deliberately, provoked the Soviets to send in troops. Bruce Riedel, however, believes that the U.S. aid was intended primarily to improve U.S. relations with Pakistan, while Steve Collisert's contemporary memos, particularly those written in the first days after the Soviet invasion, make clear that while Brzezinski was determined to confront the Soviets in Afghanistan through covert action, he was also very worried the Soviets would prevail. Given this evidence, and the enormous political and security costs that the invasion imposed on the Carter administration, any claim that Brzezinski lured the Soviets into Afghanistan warrants deep skepticism. Carter himself has stated that encouraging a Soviet invasion was not my intention. Gates recounted, "No one in the Carter administration wanted the Soviets to invade Afghanistan, and no one, as I can recall at least, ever advocated attempting to induce them to invade. Only after the Soviet invasion did some advocate making the Soviets bleed in their own Vietnam." Conversely, Andrew Bacevich writes that the prospect of inducing conflict on the scale of Vietnam exerted great appeal in the White House even prior to the Soviet invasion, as fomenting trouble in Afghanistan would dissuade the Soviets from meddling in the Persian Gulf. Chalmers Johnson considered the Soviet invasion deliberately provoked by the U.S., although Gates described Director of Central Intelligence Stansfield Turner and the CIA's Directorate of Operations as contemplating several enhancement options, up to and including the direct provision of arms from the U.S. to the Mujahideen through the IC, as early as late August 1979, and an unnamed Brzezinski aide acknowledged in conversation with Selig S. Harrison that the USS nominally non-lethal assistance to the Mujahideen included facilitating arms shipments by third parties. Cole, Harrison, Riedel, and the head of the DOU's Near East South Asia division at the time, Charles Cogan, all state that no U.S.-supplied arms intended for the Mujahideen reached Pakistan until January 1980, after Carter amended his presidential finding to include lethal provisions in late December 1979. Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Would you like to know more?